Well, good afternoon if you find me in most of the United States or Canada. It's almost time for evening tea in Dublin, where my guest is today. It is somewhere overnight in Asia and in Tokyo and Hawaii. Top of the morning to you there. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays. The date happens to be March 19th of 2021. So 2 days after St. Patrick's Day, which is a coincidence and not the reason that I have my wonderful Irish guest here today, Deborah Kelleher. Deborah is the director of the Royal Irish Academy of Music and one of the best educators, administrators, advocates for the arts that I know anywhere in the world. So, Deborah, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Fred. I'm delighted to be virtually seeing you.
Well, it's second best to be actually being there. I'm going to explain how you and I met one another because, big backstory, I adore Ireland and I go there whenever I can. That's the short issue. I was out wandering the beautiful streets of Dublin one day. It was misty and overcast, and the temperature was about 50 degrees or 10 degrees centigrade. And I was in a terrific mood, and I was passing Greens and past a house where Oscar Wilde had lived. And then I turned a corner onto Westland Row, and I spotted a building that said Royal Irish Academy of Music. And because I'm not shy and the Irish are friendly, I rang the bell and a gentleman let me in. And I said, my name is Fred, and this is what I do. And I love music. And he said, I'm not going to do many accents. Let me take you to Deborah. And all of a sudden, I was transported upstairs and brought into your office not 5 minutes after I rang the bell. I was not, frankly, dressed for the occasion to be presented to you, but you welcomed me and we began a conversation that we are continuing to this day. And that first day you took me around the school. There were students in a corridor and they were seated and you basically said, talk to them. And so we began a 90-minute question and answer conversation that I loved. And then you said, I want you to see a music class going on. And you took me to see who I discovered to be very famous, legendary, we can say this, Irish soprano and master teacher, Veronica Dunn, known as Ronnie Dunn. And that was the first time I met Deborah. And I've seen you subsequently in New York and back in Dublin. And we've done things together. And I've spoken at the Italian Institute in Dublin on Irish and Italy and so forth. It's become a wonderful friendship. And so listeners should know that today I'm speaking not to a stranger, but to a friend. And why did you let me in and give me all that time that day?
Fred, it's a strange thing because I do run a national conservatoire, but we're not a national conservatoire like this huge behemoth of a thing. In Ireland, everything is kind of small and perfectly formed. And with that, it means you can be maybe a little bit more agile, a little bit more open than your traditional behemoth conservatoire. You were so knowledgeable about music that it was obvious that you had credentials, because we don't let any old person in off the street. But we like to understand about other cultures. We like to understand about other people. And we're very curious, I think, as a nation and also as our students. So there was just such a great buzz around what you were able to talk about, because you've such immense experience in opera and the vocal world in particular. And our guys, and it was kind of magical because we found ourselves in New York for a different project there, and I could reach out to you and there you were, and suddenly we were in your area with some of these singers that you had met before, and we were on your home turf, and that was amazing for us to have met you even by happenstance, and then going to New York, the Big Apples, the pinnacle of some people's dreams, and to see you there was just absolutely super. So we would be friendly to people coming in and having a look. It's just our way.
Well, I must openly declare my love for Ireland and the Irish. That's hardly unique to me, except that many people associate me with Italy, justifiably, because much of my life and work have been there. but I grew up in a part of New York City that was very culturally mixed. And when I was a very small child, my mother worked, and I was left with an Irish family named the Rogers. And they didn't have much money, but they had a lot of love in their household. And they made a few extra dollars looking after me. And I remember, had a very long table and they didn't turn on the lights very much. And around about 6 o'clock in the evening, my mother would come about 7. Mrs. Rogers would serve tea and toast and jam, and everybody would start singing. And
Wow.
for an hour, they sang Irish songs. And somehow, among my earliest musical memories, apart from in my own family, are the Rogers, 9 children, singing Irish music and talking about himself and herself. And it was like a bit like being in a Sean O'Casey play.
Well, in the census of New York in 1855, 40% of the population was Irish because of the Great Famine and the sheer volume that went over to New York and made their lives there. But music was a particularly powerful way of keeping that connection. And so the oral tradition being passed on. I mean, if you were to analyze the music of the Everly Brothers, you would find major Irish traditional kind of riffs in their music, even though, poppy or rock and rolly as it was. So, throw a stone and you're going to find an Irish person or the Irish diaspora in New York, which probably makes us feel so at home when we visit there. It's probably why.
A couple of years ago, Carnegie Hall does an annual series with a special theme. And long before the issue of migration, immigration, emigration, all those words are a bit different, was the hot topic. Carnegie Hall had planned this as regards music. And they specifically, because we're in New York City, focused on 3 groups. The Irish and Scots, but especially the Irish, were number 1. Number 2 were the Eastern European Jews. Number 3 were people of the African diaspora, mostly African American, but not only, also Caribbean. And how these 3 found expression in New York, but also how they mixed, and the degree to which Jews played jazz and African Americans drew from the Irish spoken tradition, and Irish liked the Jewish humor. And it was a fascinating symposium for several months of the dialogue among these 3 musical heritages. And
I think that's amazing. I mean, Irish traditional music can blend. There are some amazing artists like Donal Lunny, who does manage to blend, African beats, even, syncopation is not natural to Irish traditional music. So, one of the most famous exports recently was Riverdance, and that's an amazing melange. I mean, Bill Whelan did the music for Riverdance, and you have this very, very traditional Irish sound, but you've got these dancers in a row like the Rockettes, which is, by the way, not at all Irish. And then you have syncopation. Da 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 dum bum 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 ba da da da. That's, you'd break your ankle if you were a traditional Irish dancer, untrained in doing that. But I think our music tends, because it is relatively simple, it tends to cry out for actually more complex things, to reimagine it. I find it very exciting when I see that combination of different cultures coming together.
And you bring something up, that music, and especially beat and rhythm, is expressed also in the feet. And in the 1910s and 20s, but for all of our history, we have what's either called tap dancing or beat dancing. And in New York City, of course, African Americans splendidly, but also many Jewish performers. And James Cagney, and Irish performers, and they all learn from one another. And the very best of these dancers knew how to do what we call in singing rubato, where you slightly extend a note or a beat, and the audience is listening also to the feet, and you expect a foot to land at a certain point, and then the dancer will hold his or her foot just a fraction of a second and then put it down. It's so very exciting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, that reminds me, firstly, I think dance is amazing. I just wish, we have a big junior school, and a great wish of mine is that our kids would learn to dance at the same time they're learning their music, because there's nothing better than that. But that idea of a dancer who just goes that millisecond longer. I remember being in a masterclass with Michael Eliasson, who runs the opera program in the Curtis, and in bel canto singing and all, holding that note just longer than you think is even feasible is actually the right length. And I think that's what the artist is. It's that moment between doing the right thing and slightly pushing it that probably is the difference between greatness and playing by the rules, I suppose.
So that's a bit of my Irish credentials, and I'll just further add on that I first came to Dublin in 1976 when I was 20, and I had been living in Italy, and I had a chance to study in London. I decided to extend further and come to Dublin, and I traveled to Galway, and because I wanted to rediscover the Ireland and the Irish that I knew in New York. And I remember so well what a woman said to me in Galway. She said, the Irish are much more subtle than you think. And her words all those years ago, it's quite a number of years ago, remain in my head because I took that as the template for thinking about the Irish and not simply as cheerful expressions of the people I knew in New York. And it impelled me to study Irish history and culture and literature and music and everything else. And with her framing of the Irish being more subtle than we think. Do you agree with her?
I do. As she said, as you said what she said, I thought about what I would call the Irish no, which is very familiar, that we can't bear to be straight, we can't bear to disappoint anybody. So the Irish no is us saying yes, 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 and then just it never materializing or us walking away from that. So I suppose the subtlety, I think we are a nation that wants to communicate. I think that is very much on our surface. I think we would have struggled historically with spies and informers, so we can be charming to your face and a little bit treacherous behind your back. That would be, we had these endless rebellions, which was amazing, but it was always felled by spy networks giving information. So I think that's maybe the negative part, but I think as a race, I think we want to please, we want to connect, we want to reach out, but then the subtlety comes in understanding actually what we're saying, because we won't really want to say it straight. So I get the subtlety bit.
Well, a funny equivalent of the Irish no, which is an Irish yes, was a number of years ago. I was way out in the country somewhere and I asked for directions. I don't drive a car by choice. So I walk and I go by bicycle and public transport. And I went into a pub. I wanted to go to the town where John F. Kennedy's family was from.
Oh, yeah.
Wanted to know if I could walk. There was that sort of Wexford, Waterford, that area. And if I could walk there, and I walked into a pub, and again, I'll do a slight approximation of the accent. And I said, how do I get to this place? And the woman, the wife of the publican, said, oh, you go this way and down there, and you go by the church, and then you pass the second cow, and so on, this direction. Can I walk? Of course you can. And I walked outside, and her husband came out, and he said, don't do that. She hasn't been there in 30 years.
Yeah, directions. Or the thing, if you go to the bridge with the red paint on it, you've gone too far. That's very Irish, very Irish. Well, we can't always live in New York with the great grid system.
I know. But another thing, and I don't recall who said it. My guess is O'Casey. I don't think it was Shaw or Oscar Wilde. I think it was O'Casey. And I'm paraphrasing, said that to the Irish, comedy is very serious and tragedy is comic.
Yes, I do remember that. I think our plays and our literature, isn't it incredible how much they have gone around the world? I mean, as a nation, for our small size, there is something very profound about how far Yeats and Synge and Joyce have gone. They may arguably have done no favors for classical music. This is what one of our writers, Harry White, said once about classical music in Ireland, that the literature and poetry and plays were so intensely musical in themselves that they almost robbed the composer of his or her voice. Because if you listen to them, the musicality of them is almost as important as the words. And yes, there is a kind of a mordant, dark humor, even in the worst of times, and a kind of a heaviness in the lighter moments, lest you think it's not significant. Yeah, it's a treat to go to
And you
plays.
encounter this everywhere. I brought my mother, who you know, to Dublin a few years ago, and we saw each other. And my mother developed a bit of a cold or a chill, and we went to a local physician who would only write the prescription for the medication in Gaelic. And I said, "What does it mean?" He said, "I'm not telling you."
Oh my God.
So I didn't know what medicine I was getting from my mother.
Yes,
We got in a taxi, and I asked the driver to look at it, and he said, "We're all dying. We're all dying."
we're all dying. Well, hats off to the doctor who could have killed your mother through his adherence to the Gaeltacht. Yeah.
But but I feel very alive in Ireland, and that's
Yeah.
part of the joy there. When New York gets a bit intense, we're talking about a time when one could get on a plane without worrying about a pandemic. Out of season flights between New York and Dublin are very cheap
Mm.
and easily had. And I've just been known to get on the plane to come to Dublin to walk around the streets and chatter with people. And if you're there and other friends are there, see you. But just on my own, stay in a rooming house in a neighborhood, not in a fancy hotel, and talk to people.
Yeah.
And it's a remarkable thing. And I think the sociability, which is not forced, is genuine hospitality and human engagement, is at the very heart of what I love about Ireland, and brings me directly to the question. Irish performers,
Mm.
without being forced, have this human engagement and contact. I'm not going to call it charm because that's not much of a word in this case, but a genuine humanity
Mm.
that I always feel, whether it's an opera singer, whether it's a singer of popular Irish song, or an instrumentalist who's not speaking. I feel it. Am I mistaken?
No, I don't think you are. And, it's hard to understand why, but I do believe that as a nation, we are geared to communicate. We're geared to tell stories. We're geared to kind of express things. Our soul comes through our eyes or through our lips or our hands. Um, and I used to think also it was a cliche, but then I would visit other countries and there would be a more formal demeanor. There might be something that I wasn't sensing, an informality that we just have. It's very powerful when you combine that with artistry. If the artistry is of a very high standard, or even when it's not, and you're just sharing for family. But if you're an audience member and going to see an Irish artist, they're desperate to communicate. I remember one beautiful ex-student of the Academy, Ailish Tynan, she said to me that she's a soprano. She walks out on stage and she fully believes that people are dying to hear what's coming out of her mouth. And to have that sense that, just the audience is really there. They really, really want to hear what you have to say. And you really, really want to communicate something, I think is very clear. Because if you're not fighting to communicate, then kind of what's the point? And I don't know what it is. I suppose we were a small nation that fought valiantly against the English conqueror for 800 years. And how a small nation sustains itself when it doesn't have wealth and it doesn't have power probably is the stories of the valiant heroes of the past sharing this. And that possibly gave us an overweening sense of our size. We're a little bit like the king in Shrek. We probably think we're bigger than we are. But I think maybe those stories would have sustained us. And maybe it's just in our DNA that we want to keep on telling the story, even if it's changed a bit.
So the comments you just made raises two things in my head. Number one, I really am Irish because I understand that feeling of loving to communicate with an audience and with one friend and millions that they're watching and so on. And it's a pleasure. It's not ego. It's a pleasure. That's number one. Number two, if Ireland was under English domination for 800 years, why is it called the Royal Irish Academy of Music?
Yes, there are a few institutions in Ireland that still have the royal status. So the Royal Irish Academy of Music, the Royal Irish Academy, which is an institute of learning that gets a lot of our mail, the Royal Dublin Society, and the Royal Irish Automobile Association. So what happened is that we were founded in 1848 by mostly the Anglo-Irish, who were people living in Ireland of English descent. And in 1871, the Duke of Edinburgh came to Ireland, and everywhere he visited, more or less, got a royal status. So he turned up, he visited the Academy, he went to a concert, and subsequently we got our royal status. It was and is a very prestigious thing to be able to call yourself royal. Now, in the 20th century, when we'd achieved independence, the governors of the Academy had a bit of a mind change. And in the 1950s, they decided to cut the royal and call themselves the Irish Academy of Music. But then in the 1960s, Princess Grace and Prince Rainier were visiting the Academy, or they were visiting Ireland, and anyone who got a royal status in their thing got a visit. So you mentioned, Fred, coming up Westland Row and knocking on the door of the Academy. If you looked closely at the brass plate, Royal is really small and Irish Academy of Music is quite big, because they literally tapped in the 1960s, the Royal back in again. And we had this amazing visit. So aside from that kind of rather motley history, what I would say is, if you start to rename things in Ireland, you would never get to the end of it, because there are streets named after people. You know, Padraig Pearse was a great Irish hero, but then other revisionists might say that he was a bloody revolutionary. So do we change Pearse Street to something else? So for me, I think Royal is part of our history. I think internationally, and we do have an ambitious international agenda, it places us in a position with a lot of the other kind of royal academies around Europe. But it is, I would say there are people that wouldn't necessarily come to us or buy into us because of the presence of that word. It still is a very powerful word in Ireland.
Well, let's not forget that Princess Grace of Monaco was originally Grace Kelly,
Yes.
Irish, of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So if it was good enough for Princess Grace, it's good enough for me. She was a great patron of the arts, and a period early in my career, there was on Park Avenue in the Japan Society, in the Asia Society, an office of the Princess Grace Foundation that I worked in that supported young artists and young aspiring musicians, dancers, singers, actors. And I met Princess Grace through that, because she maintained her interest in supporting the arts. So that is fine. It also, you raised the important question of, I don't believe in forgetting history, even if history is not pleasant or perfect. When I decided to have a career in the arts, chose to study history as my major, thinking that most of the work that I'd be working on came from the past. Yes, I'd love to be involved in the creation of new work, but if I'm working on an opera that was born in Vienna, or if I'm teaching a concerto that was written in Paris, then I need to know the history surrounding those places. And no, history is not perfect, but we learn from it. And if we choose to ignore, for example, that there was a pandemic in 1918, then we don't remember how to respond for future pandemics. And if a particular political figure was of his time and not perfect, we can acknowledge that, but I don't think we should just cancel that person.
Yeah, I would agree with you. History is very interesting. Even the canon of musical works, we decided who was an A-list composer, a B-list composer at the end of the 19th century. It was a bunch of Germans and Austrians. And we know that, and we were conditioned to celebrate and enjoy a certain kind of narrow canon of music, which excluded other people while it included certain people. But that doesn't make it desperately flawed. It just means we now have the great gift in the 21st century of exploring new people, of questioning the canon and revisiting the canon, but you don't throw the canon out the window. It just makes life more interesting.
True. And we can compare and juxtapose, and we can discover, for example, in the case of Grieg and in the case of certain Irish composers, they may have gone to Leipzig to study. And therefore, the influences that they may have found in Leipzig of Bach from the past and Mendelssohn and Schumann and so on, it's important to find those connections. I want to go back to the becoming royal in 1871. The Duke of Edinburgh was the second son of Queen Victoria. And whatever we can say about Queen Victoria, I will say one thing: she loves music and she loves opera. Oh. And that's a very important thing. And at the Royal Opera House in London, they don't tell you this much, but there is a box that belonged to her that is on the side in the first tier on house right, stage left. And you would think that she would sit in such a way that she could be seen by the public, by her subjects. But what she did was she sat with her back to the wall on the side of the box where she could not be seen. But she could see the audience and had a mirror in front of her so that she could see what was happening on the stage. I've been in that box. And therefore, she watched and listened to the opera, but was present for her subjects, her public. It
Wow.
was very, very interesting. I don't know of any other attendee of any musical art form who basically attended that way so that she could see the public in addition to having a mirror reflection of what was happening on the stage. But she went to the Royal Opera House 3 times a week.
Oh my goodness, I did
Yeah,
not know
she
that.
went constantly, constantly.
Well, my God, because she wasn't doing many of her duties after Albert died, but she was getting in her opera. Fair play to her.
Which actually, in a strange way that these conversations go, brings us back to Ireland. Because in the previous century, Georg Friedrich Handel, who was from Germany, but lived in Italy for learning his opera training, and then moved to London and became the great opera composer and impresario in London in the 18th century, in the 1700s, famously came to Dublin.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what did he do in Dublin? I believe in 1741, though I'm not
That's
certain.
right.
Yeah.
I was only thinking about this today. He was short of funds, so the Duke of Devonshire hired him to come over to Ireland for a period. I think he was here about 10 months. And during that time, he put on the first performance of Messiah. Now, Handel, when he first came over, he was, I think, in his own words, I think he actually used the word mortified to be premiering it in Dublin. But he really took to the country. He really, what we were talking about earlier, Fred, actually, he liked the informality of the people. It was less stuffy than London. The newspapers were less horrible. He really liked Irish music. So he became very friendly with the publisher called Mr. Hill on, I think, Capel Street. But they put on Messiah, and it obviously, it being an oratorio, less expensive, didn't have to be staged, and they sold 700 tickets for a 600-seater. And the ladies had to not wear hoops in their dresses. The men had to not wear their dress swords. And it was a rip-roaring success. I mean, I love Handel and the English oratorio because he finally cracked the market, and opera just wasn't doing it for him in London, the poor old guy. But that was it. And so it was hugely successful and has been so in Ireland, absolutely from the beginning of that until today. We perform Messiah a lot. I don't know if it's big in America, but it's massive in Ireland and the UK.
It is big in America. I just want to point out first, I think he wrote it premiered in Dublin, let's say, to benefit either an orphans hospital or children's hospital or orphanage, something like that.
It was a foundling hospital. It was an orphanage. Yeah.
Yeah. No, Messiah, and friends who are listening, it's not the Messiah, it's called Messiah, has been hugely popular in America, and most especially in New York. We have a church called Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, where I don't want to give the wrong date, but let's say approximately 1750 or 60, something like that. It has been performed every single year in the Christmas season. Now, Handel, it was originally composed to be about Easter, about King is King, born is born, about that story. But in America, it got transferred to Christmas and has been, George Washington worshiped at that church, and it has been a great tradition. And in 2001, when on September 11th, the World Trade Center was destroyed, Trinity Church stands across the street from that site. And I must say that we all assumed that we lost the church with that, and George Washington's Bible and Alexander Hamilton's tomb and all kinds of things were there. The very first performance of Silent Night in America was given in that church. And miraculously, it stood. And the organ pipes were completely filled with ash and dust from this horrible tragedy of 9/11 of the World Trade Center. And the fires continued. People don't know this, well after September 11th. And they were put out only on December 16th, so that the air was very thick with pollution and exhaust, and many people who work down there, live down there, had terrible health consequences we're still seeing today. And there was great discussion about, do we do Messiah in Trinity Church to continue the tradition or not? And my radio station, WQXR, would broadcast it live every year. And the decision was made to do it. And the organ pipes were so stuffed that it was a wheezy organ that year. And people were coughing as they sang. But we just considered it essential that we not let terrorism or anything stop this tradition. So the organ has been restored, the church has been cleaned up, and it continues every year. So that's a fixed appointment for Messiah that's heard nationally. But it's done everywhere all the time. And it's the most famous, I think, most famous musical premiere Dublin has had.
Oh, yeah. Well, Fred, I am going to tell you something. It's not famous, but it's really cute. Dublin was the venue of the first performance of a solo piano recital in 1768, about 2 weeks before it happened in London.
Field?
No, it was way before John Field. And I don't even know what the music was, but we had some piano makers that came to Dublin because usually born in Germany, couldn't get traction in London. So they came to Dublin, some really, really fine instrument makers. Like, we'll take anybody, Fred, if they're good. I don't care how they're doing in London, they're welcome in Dublin. So we snuck in history's first piano recital. And I owe that information to a man called Alec Cobb, who has a famous collection of instruments, really famous instruments, Liszt's piano, that kind of thing. So it's not as famous as Messiah, but it is sneaky in its own way that we beat London to the first solo piano recital. Fun fact.
It leads me, as this discussion does, as our discussions always do, Deborah, to the fact that with Brexit recently, you're talking about bypassing London and so on. How has the fact that it's become more difficult for, quote, foreign students to go to the UK to study at their music academies, but those who are part of the European Union or perhaps from further away now seek Dublin, and they're discovering, I'll say this, you don't have to, what an outstanding school you run, but I think that the Royal Irish Academy of Music has, in a strange way, benefited from Brexit, or correct me if you think I'm wrong.
Yes, it has. I mean, the first thing I would say is that Brexit is an awful shame for musicians, because you have these new challenges with visas, that it's difficult to get out of the UK if you're in UK orchestra to do your tours, and it's difficult for foreign musicians to get into the UK and get permits. I mean, it's just instantly become very tricky. But then Ireland, I'm Irish of Ireland, we're the last remaining country in the EU that is English speaking. So that's a very big aspect. Yes, we have had an increase in students applying, because students from the EU going to the London conservatoires in Manchester and Scotland and Wales, they will now have to pay international fees. And that is, you're going from 11,000 sterling to 28,000 sterling. And that makes it a big challenge. Whereas in Ireland, our fees are subsidized. In an EU, if you're a bachelor level Italian violinist, you can study in Ireland for €3,000 a year. So I mean, it's in these times, money talks, notwithstanding the fact that the English conservatories and the UK conservatories in Scotland and Wales as well, they're outstandingly good. But the government has not made it easy for them to hang on to international students, and they feel it. I mean, there were some amazing photos. Barry Ife, who was the principal of the Guildhall School of Music at the time, took a photo of an orchestra, and then he said, now this is the orchestra without the EU students. And it was half full, and it was really sad to see that. I have to say that my UK colleagues are reaching out to us a lot. We will have shared projects. We will continue to admire them and work with them. But I suppose from an Irish context, we say, 800 years we fought, but we really admire and imitate the UK a lot. And what we're finding, Fred, now is that we have to look further. We have to stretch ourselves and look for non-EU European partners. Now we're actually just at the end of an Erasmus EU program this week with partners from Cyprus, from Turkey, and from Italy, the Santa Cecilia Conservatory in Rome, which is a fantastic conservatory, and a university in Cyprus. I mean, Cyprus is at the intersection of 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So for us now, we have this new and rich opportunity to fall in love with countries that maybe we didn't think about because the UK was such a leader and such a standard for us. But then on the other hand, we have gifts and strengths that countries like Cyprus and Italy and Turkey can now really celebrate. So it's forced us out of our comfort zone, Fred, I would say. That's probably it.
You addressed a lot of what I was about to ask you, but I'll take it a little further. Irish students and Irish people, but let's focus on students in your academy. How have they changed, learned, influenced, use whatever verb you want, from the presence of students from Romania? I was there were Romanians, there were Koreans. I know I've seen a couple of Italians there. When it was, let's say, all Irish or mostly strongly Irish, was it different for the students? I'm not talking about for the faculty, but for the students in terms of the way it is now?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, we're in an expansion mode. So every year our student body is growing. And at the moment, 20% of our tertiary students are non-EU. So probably maybe 30% are not Irish and 70% are Irish. And I would say as a nation, we're very good at emigrating, and we welcome immigrants, but we don't always assimilate them the way that countries who have a longer tradition of this do. So I have seen in recent times that we've got better at reaching out, integrating and welcoming in the students in the academy. And I have to say, Fred, I would give full credit to our Students' Union, because our Students' Union we're listening more to what our Students' Union and our students are saying. It's actually a trend in conservatoires to listen to the student voice more. And my goodness, Fred, they are well able for this. So the Students' Union have taken on themselves as kind of leaders in the student body to do simple things, Fred, have social events, have welcoming events, have buddies. For us, not always students coming to Ireland would have excellent English. So we would do English language classes where they would be able to talk to each other, get better at conversation. But I think we still have a fair way to go, Fred, in understanding different cultures and how they tick. So, you can overstep or you can do the wrong thing without really knowing it. And I don't think we're at that depth and that level of sophistication. But what we're trying to do is develop trust so that our students, if something does happen that they're not comfortable with, can actually say it to us. So baby steps, but I see our institution a lot more integrated than it would have been even, say, 5 years ago, which isn't that long ago.
A question I've never asked or not often asked an educator is, in my many years of teaching, I worked in the art form, but I began teaching and mentoring relatively early, and have noticed from one culture and nation to another, the degree to which people feel free to ask questions or not. There are some societies like mine, like America, where they do ask questions. When I was a student at university in Italy, one of my professors was Umberto Eco, and the students were petrified to ask a question. And he was accustomed to not being asked questions. And I politely raised my hand, and he was not pleased with that. I didn't call out, but he was not used to the flow being interrupted with a question, even if it was frankly a good question that would make him say something different. In Ireland, especially at the Royal Irish Academy of Music, but also, let's say, at Trinity College, is there a tradition of questioning and answering and dialogue, or is it really formal lecturing and students sitting back?
Again, I think it's times are evolving, because what you're describing when I was in college, I remember people who asked questions were almost punished for because of this sense of it being a flow. And even if it was a lecture, it was a performance in that sense, and they didn't want that. Nowadays, it is encouraged that students would ask questions, but it's still quite early days. It goes back to the master apprentice model, I think, in conservatoires, Fred. It's the whole tradition of music conservatoires is that you have a master who has mastered music, playing the violin or singing, and that the apprentice is someone without those skills that sits at their knees basically and learns all the master says, and then they in turn pass it on. Modern education is shifting. It's getting more student focused, that the master doesn't just transmit anymore, that it's a one-way going, that actually the master has to listen and respond to the students' gifts, the students' needs, the students' setbacks. So in a way, in the master apprentice model, people used to just teach like themselves. They wanted to always see people that were mirror images of themselves, but we're all unique. And that is more to do with modern education. So in modern education, you are encouraged to ask questions. But I would say, Fred, there's a kind of a balance between a kind of the conservatives and the progressives, and finding that balance and having teachers maybe change, because how you teach is very much about your identity as well. So if someone suddenly is asking you questions, then it can almost feel like a personal attack. So it's we try to encourage, by training our staff, to be a little bit more open, and to encourage our students to ask questions in a constructive way, because you can ask questions in different ways as well that can either be a little bit negative or can lead to very interesting conversations. It's definitely changing.
You've seen me lecture and teach, so you know my approach. I don't like being interrupted with questions when I'm getting the flow going, because it's an energy. Yes, you said it's a performance, even if I don't think of it as performative, but I know in my head where I'm building to, and then sometimes inspiration kicks in and I'll think of something I hadn't planned to say. But I always tell my audience, I will take questions after. Please write down your questions and I'll feel free to try to answer anything. One thing among many, many things that the Royal Irish Academy of Music has done very well and innovated in is the training of teachers. I will say that by comparison, in the United States, many of our arts institutions, certainly the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in Carnegie Hall and the Metropolitan Opera, not only, all over the country, there are programs where these cultural institutions teach or give study plans for education in the schools, which is terrific. What is distinct and different at the Royal Irish Academy of Music is that you've created, I believe it was November 2013, if I'm correct, an institute of training and teaching of teachers. And your 7,000 teachers in Ireland have trained to teach. And then we're going to get to Veronica Dunn, but just in general, this concept.
Yeah, this is something that actually started back at 1894 in the Academy. Well, in a way, in 1894, we founded a national exam system. And what this was we set a syllabus and we set a graded syllabus. And then our examiners would go around the country into, it was called the local centre exam system, into any village or borough that had sufficient students and would examine them in their own hometown. And I love this idea that you'd go and you'd be in your own place with your own piano and you'd be examined. Now, that was a kind of a light touch curriculum. So a teacher, if they followed it, they'd know this is the appropriate technique and this is the appropriate music for this level. And then you go up another step, up another step. Now, in the 20th century, and you're right, in 2013 in particular, we said, okay, but how do we further help teachers? Because Fred, we have a very big network of private music teachers. You know, there are probably more teachers, private music teachers, than there are people working, selling cars or in the car industry in Ireland. So, but this is an unregulated sector and it can be very isolated. So they're sitting in their house in Mayo and their students are coming in how do they get better? Where's their network? Where are their colleagues? Who inspires them to do more? So we set up the REAM Teaching Network, Teaching and Learning Network, then it was called. And now what we have is we have online and live workshops. We have a curriculum, but we're also listening to the teacher, and they're feeding back to us how students are changing, how improvisation maybe is becoming more interesting and relevant than sight reading, for instance. So or how students are learning in a different way. So it's very symbiotic, but yeah, we wanted to raise standards of music nationally. And now with the advent of online technology, it's incredible because you can actually do these kinds of things that are hugely popular. It's through the roof, really, but you don't have to leave your house anymore and come up to Dublin and stay over in order to work on repertoire, to ask questions. So yeah, we would feel as a national conservatoire that we have a responsibility to work with teachers nationally to make sure that the students are setting their own goals and achieving what's best. And that's about, you know, always raising standards. No one is ever perfect.
But I find it fascinating. Everything you say also about the feedback is very important. I had not factored that in. That I've met music teachers in Ireland who have been directly trained through the Royal Irish Academy without my mentioning to them that I know you and that I've spoken at the Academy. But the degree to which there's a connection, it's as if they feel connected to the Academy because on Westland Road, because of their experience with it, and therefore they have an emotional investment in its well-being. Does the Irish government recognize how important this is?
Yes, I mean,
Okay.
again, the history of the Academy is really interesting. There's a book called To Talent Alone, which is the official history of the Academy. And, you know, when in the 1916 Rising, there are minutes from the Academy's governors to, you know, try and figure out, well, who's the government? Where do we get our annual grant from? Or when Ireland became independent in 1922, it was the same thing. The government started to give us a very solid grant. In fact, they support 40% of our operating budget comes from the government. That's big, Fred. 40% is amazing. And that kicked in the 1980s, and it got, you know, before the financial crisis, they were actually giving us 51%. That fell back. That's okay. You know, I believe that you have to stand on your own feet to a certain proportion, but it's still an amazing thing that they give us that significant amount. And actually, when we were developing at the moment, so the lovely red carpet area where you sat and spoke to the students, that is gone, Fred. It's rubble because we're building a much bigger campus. I learned by looking at Juilliard when I visited you that we needed a better campus, but the government came in and I went to them at the time looking for support, but they weren't going to give me every single penny, and I didn't ask for it. I said, I'd like your 40%. I just want you to give me what I normally do, but give me that for the building and I will find the rest. And they did, Fred. So, you know, I have to say the Irish government, within the constraints that it has, supports the arts. It could always be more. But when push comes to shove, they are there and they have a good support with the Arts Council and with the institutions like ourselves. And that's really great as someone working in arts education in Ireland to know that.
Am I correct? Ireland has 4 or 5 million people in the country and something like 40 million Irish in America and Irish everywhere, but in Ireland, 4 or 5 million.
That's right. About five or so million if you count Northern Ireland, and about 4 or so million in the Republic.
So therefore, a government supporting the arts to that degree in what is a small country is quite remarkable. I parallel it in some ways with Finland. I've taught at the Sibelius Academy, and Finland has 5.2 million people and geographically much bigger than Ireland, but a similar sense of connection to language, to music, to identity, and support of the arts in a small politically small nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think Finland after World War II really invested in the arts in a probably maybe the most profound way in the world at the time. So they would be a model, I would say, in terms of the specialist music schools they have all over the place and the real access. I mean, the Scandinavian countries actually have done fantastic things for music. We envy them, but I like the cards we've been dealt in Ireland on the whole, is what I'd say, Fred.
Well, Ireland is sort of Western Scandinavia. How about that?
That's
With
a
a
good way
better
of putting
sense
it.
of humor.
That's a good. I've met some funny Finns, I have to say.
I've met two funny Finns. The Finns are not nearly as extroverted as the Irish. I love the
No.
Finns. Let's not kid for that for a minute. I love Finland, but it's a different temperament from Ireland completely. So I was going to talk about Veronica Dunn. We will get to her. I definitely want to, but you said something that triggered a thought in my head. Yes, you and I are speaking this way now via Zoom, and I have a wonderful engineer in Berlin, Johan, who's takes care of this every week. I have realized about myself that we have different kinds of brains. There are those who have a technological brain, which doesn't mean they don't have artistic and other abilities. There are those who have a musical brain. I find that I don't have a tech brain. I have a musical brain. I have a word brain. I have a language brain. I think it's fair to say, and one of my languages is music. I obviously I'm not having trouble having this conversation. It circumstance that I love when I'm teaching or speaking in front of an audience and experiencing the energy that comes from them, but also I know when they're not connected, so to speak, when they're flagging, and I change my discourse if I feel that I'm perhaps meandering too much on a detail, and I'll cut it short. There are people who thrive on technology, what's called artificial intelligence, which is a term I despise. I don't want artificial intelligence. I want real intelligence. Talk about teaching music in this kind of medium. We've had to now for the pandemic, but I think it may continue after the pandemic.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, Ireland shut down on the 12th of March 2020, and we took a week in the academy, and then we pivoted to wholly online teaching. And what we did, Fred, is, well, first of all, we just went for it because you just had to. And it was Zoom, and it was, we got some experts in who were already in the academy, who are techie people, say, what's the best possible sound you can get? So we did immediate triage, and then we had 12 digital working groups looking at, how do you teach in groups? How do you teach voice in groups? How do you teach, so we broke our components down. It is, and so what we did then is we said to our community in June, we kind of put a bet on what was going to happen for the whole year of this academic year, because we had people who were going to pay tuition fees. That was my thing. And I wanted to give them absolute clarity in an uncertain world of what to expect. So we said, okay, everything that's in groups is going to be online for the whole year, but we are going to do everything we can to make one-to-one in-person tuition live and in person. And if there's a lockdown level 5, which is our highest level, we can't do that. But aside from that, we're going to focus on the one-to-one, because for us, our teachers said it is difficult to teach online.
So Deborah, I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
Speaking of tech.
Oh, yeah.
So the internet connection went unstable, and whatever you said, I didn't hear it.
Oh my goodness.
That's an example of what I mean.
I know.
We're back.
Has it come back a little bit more?
Yeah, it's
oh my
fine
goodness, how strange.
Well, it may not be Ireland, it may be New York or Germany.
Well, I will try not to move. But
what were you saying before?
Yeah. In a nutshell, we decided that as a conservatoire, our academic classes, our theory classes would all be online for the whole year. No change, no matter what happened, it would be online, so that we could emphasize one-to-one in-person teaching, because, Fred, it is difficult to do the finer detail online in one-to-one. That said, what I've found is that teachers and students they're finding the bonuses. So this is, if you have to be online, these are the positives, right? Our students often record themselves and send it to their teacher. And in recording yourself, you listen to yourself more. If you're in a live situation, you're just on transmit, but the student mightn't want to send something. So they're more critical and more thoughtful of themselves than the teacher. The teacher in turn isn't constantly interrupting them, isn't able to do that. So the teacher can just listen to the piece and make notes and feed it back. With singers, they're focusing much more on language, on text, on meaning, because they don't just always have to sing everything. So that's one major aspect of it. And then also we have live streamed competitions and concerts. So our students are learning to perform live and in person, but in a small, just them and the recorder and maybe a jury. But that's a different skill to performing on a stage for a big group of people. So they're learning different skills. They're learning digital skills, much more digital savvy, which is going to be important for the world in the future. But I think their quality of listening. But then the final thing, Fred, I would say, and I'm just out of a set of exams. So we've done some live exams today. I have to say, our government, again, we have an excellent minister for further and higher education, and he's allowing universities and conservatoires in this lockdown to use discretion as to what could be live and in person, as long as it's very minimal. So our graduating years, they have to perform live and in person. And it's so special when they do, and they feel the moment of live and in person probably more profoundly. They took it for granted before this lockdown. So it's giving an extra frisson. I'm on a high after what I heard today, and it was our singers. So, Fred, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. And we will take this on. I mean, for instance, another benefit is we've had astonishing artists from masterclass at the moment. Now, they're not in the room. They're over in, we had the co-leader of the LSO. We had Mairead McCran, an Irish violinist who's the leader of the radio orchestra in Vienna. These were just 2 masterclasses just this week, because they're sitting at home. They don't have to fly here, but they're still very, very good. So, I think there's going to be a lot more international presence in the academy without them having to fly over here. And then when they do come over, Fred, it'll be so exciting and so special. That's the thing.
This brings us to the woman I consider the most legendary Irish woman since Isolde, namely Veronica Dunn.
It's a good analogy.
I think it's kind of true. I cannot think of another Irish woman who gathers all of that within her. Veronica Dunn is 93, and I hate the term force of nature, but she is a force of nature. And she was born in Ireland. She studied early on in Italy and Rome and lived in a convent with nuns. But I forget if she told me whether they were Irish nuns or Italian nuns, because that makes a big difference. And she began to sing opera in Rome and had to come back into the convent at night while singing opera. She sang with Maria Callas. She sang in Dublin and then in Welsh National Opera and Scottish Opera in Wexford. But I think somewhere along the way, she found, and I don't want to speak for her, that yes, it's wonderful to sing, but her vocation was that she's a fabulous teacher.
Yeah.
And I've watched her work, and she has trained generations not only of singers, but of teachers of singing in Ireland. And I've met many of those teachers who speak of Ronnie Dunn, not just with awe, but with gratitude. I think awe can be a bit off-putting, but with real gratitude for what she's done and how she does it. That said, I've never seen anyone teach the way she does. And I'm not saying that in a jokey way, but she is profoundly instinctive. She knows what works and what doesn't. She understands the physicality and the biology of singing. She understands musicality. She understands expression, and she's not shy. And when all of that is put together, I've noticed, for example, that sometimes a very young person, especially a young male person, um, is very formal with her because she's this august figure, and they don't know how to relax enough, and she has to work to get them to relax so they sing well. And talk about her teaching, because it's a beautiful thing to behold.
She is a force of nature. And I think everything that you've said is incredibly right. Ronnie has her own method. And one of the things she has is she has usually a stable of young singers, quite a lot of young singers, and they'd start very young and she might give them a lesson a week. And then it might go up to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 lessons a week, because Ronnie's method of teaching is almost nagging. She knows, as you say, she instinctively knows where that person's voice should be placed. And her way of doing it is not to say, go up here, put the, get the tongue out, do the, she will work with them. And the reason she sees them so much is so that it becomes natural to them, but she wants to hear, and she doesn't give a damn about her time. There's nowhere else that she wants to be. She would have singers living in her house. She would be picking up singers at 8 o'clock in the morning in her car. And this goes back decades, 50 years. She was probably doing this more. And she is almost like a singer whisperer, and that's how she does it. And yes, she is informal, and she can use some very colorful language at times, and it's not necessarily for the faint-hearted. But Fred, the results she gets are incredible. I mean, her stable includes Tara Rock, it includes Patricia Barden. From teachers, it includes Mary Brennan, who's also a superb teacher. So she has fostered a generation of singers and singing teachers in Ireland that makes us really confident of our place. The Academy has an exceptionally good vocal faculty, and we owe that somewhat to the credibility of Ronnie Dunn, and then somewhat to the genius of our current head of vocal studies and opera, Kathleen Tynan. But having a combination of someone who thinks strategically and is ambitious, but having these great teachers means that our students literally can go anywhere in the world and not be found wanting. I mean, it's quite astonishing per capita how many of our singers would be in, say, the Young Artist Program in Covent Garden or in the Bavarian Opera. And it all stems back, I think, to this great lady. She really is incredible.
When I've spoken at your school and met singers and talked to them, we've tended to keep in touch. So I followed them by email, occasionally by telephone, wherever they are and what they're doing. And sometimes they'll write and ask for a suggestion about a role or an approach to something. And I always say, what does Ronnie say? And they always have an answer, because clearly she, I guess by telephone, I don't know her technological skills, is present for all of these hundreds of musicians that she's fostered and nourished and still guides.
Yeah.
And I know she's 93, and with the pandemic, people are not traveling, but I know that she has traveled to hear singers in New York and Munich, among other places.
Oh, but I remember, Fred, and I'm going to have to turn on the light now in a minute, because you can see it's getting darker and darker and darker. But one of the things I remember, my favorite memory of Ronnie is when she taught Celine Byrne. And I don't even know if you know Celine Byrne, Fred, but Celine, there's an Irish National Opera live stream of La Boheme at the moment, and Celine is Mimi. There is no God-given voice that I can think of that is as amazing as Celine's. And Celine went to Ronnie on the master's program in the Academy, and there was an instant connection. Ronnie felt so strongly about Celine's gift, but also that they were very similar temperamentally. Verissimo repertoire was Celine's bag. It was also something that Ronnie was very passionate about, and it just was incredible. But Celine made her debut in Mimi in 2010 in Scottish Opera. And Ronnie and myself flew to the performance, and we sat like a pair of fans. Every time Celine had a glorious high note, we were nudging each other. There's no professional distance or ennui on Ronnie's part when singers sing well and do well. And it could be, she probably is more excited about a 17-year-old young tenor than she is about Celine Byrne doing her debut. But that's what it is to be an educator. I find myself that I'm more bored at professional recitals than I am in going to a student recital, because there's so much unknown and so much potential there. I'm going to turn on the lights, Fred.
Yes. So I will speak in the meantime and tell our listeners, we'll get back to Veronica Dunn, that Deborah gave me a really wonderful list of musical selections that she likes very much. So I was just saying, you gave me a wonderful list of musical selections on Adagio, and we'll get to one or two of them after. But you were talking about the joy of hearing young performers perform rather than a professional formal recital. I agree with you. But when you see your outstanding students go far in their careers, do they change? I've never asked this of anyone. Do they change as people, or do they retain what they had when they were with you?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm thinking through, I think they are still themselves. You know, when I think about, you know, I mentioned Eilish Tynan, a beautiful soprano. She was mischievous. She was a beautiful artist, but mischievous and great rapier wit. I think with Celine is I always think with Verismo singers that they're, you know, their contemplation of dark themes must be really interesting. If that's what your life is, incredible. Then there's a singer called Robin Tritchler, who even from his earliest days adored text. And if you listen to him, he's a very fine tenor, mostly based in London. Oh, wow. His love for the text. As people, I think they're still themselves. I think we adore to see each other as Irish people, especially in foreign cities and foreign countries. It never gets old. I think that's maybe something, Fred. The wonderment of being out there and being Irish and singing never gets old. So I think they take their ambassadorial status very seriously because we're a small nation and because there aren't that many of us that do very, very well. And I think that adds a frisson, maybe of gratitude to their professional lives.
Serious question. Do you think in printed programs for operas and recitals and instrumental work that musicians with Irish names, with big Irish names, should have pronunciation explanation? Niamh. How do you pronounce that?
Neve.
I know.
And, you know, Maeve, Meadbhh.
Right. And Naoise, Nisha.
Nisha, yeah, or
Yeah.
Aoife, Aoife, because Oife comes out in the UK. It's
and
tricky,
Katrina,
isn't it? Katrina, yeah.
Katrina. And I mean, I work at it and I try to get everyone's names right. But if I look at these words, these names, when I met Neve, I'm forgetting her last name, a beautiful mezzo soprano now in Munich.
Neve O'Sullivan.
Yes. I called her Nyam. I didn't know what to call her. And she didn't want to offend me when I'm happily corrected. She thought, well, you know, this teacher, whatever, I won't tell him my name. And I said, how do I pronounce your name? And she said, Neve. And I said, I think you need to tell everyone, hello, I'm Neve. Because I think it's important, really, because when I've been in Italy and you hear Italian presenters struggling with the foreign names, even my surname, Plotkin, they have trouble with. So an Irish Gaelic name would be really a challenge. I recommend that as part of your training of them in terms of being out in the world. Yeah.
I will take that under advisement.
Okay. Veronica Tyler, you have a music competition, a vocal competition. Talk about that.
The Veronica Dunn International Singing Competition.
Veronica Tyler is an American mezzo soprano. Sorry.
Yeah, this was a competition that Ronnie started, I think it might have been back in 1995. And the first winner was Orla Boylan, who I actually just sat on a jury with there for our exams. Stunning singer. And since then, it's become very international. Nadine Sierra won, who I think would be very much known to you. Fatima Saeed, another fantastic singer. We love these competitions because it's an opportunity for international singers to come to Ireland, so we enjoy them. But Ronnie very deliberately makes the jury mostly consisting of people who are running young artist programs. So this is an opportunity for the singers to do an early audition to get spotted. So a lot, and young Irish singers in particular, don't have to leave the country then to be performing in front of a jury. So there's a method in her madness. It's not just about the prize, it's about the exposure and about getting on to the next. So when I say, you know, there are amazing how many singers are on young artist programs, it's not luck. It's because we're reaching out, we're networking, we're making the connections there. But we love a good competition in Ireland. So those magical moments. But you know, Fred, I don't know if you're a fan of competitions, but I find the people that usually win competitions are seldom in doubt. Everybody really feels it. And for me, the person who wins the competition is the person who sings or plays the piano as if they're not in a competition. They're just nailing it. There's something in there that connects beyond everybody else who's trying so hard to win. The winner just in that moment, they just kind of have it. And that, I remember Nadine Sierra particularly was stunning there.
Nadine Sierra always has it. Seriously, she's a magnificent artist, and I've had her in certain artistic situations. And actually, you reminded me, I forgot about that. In a long time ago, Marilyn Horne and I did a sort of a symposium together at sea. And we had 4 young artists. We had Nadine Sierra, who was then 20, as our soprano, the wonderful mezzo Sasha Cook, Joshua Stewart, the tenor, and the wonderful Andrew Garland, the baritone. I don't know if you know him.
I do. I don't know him, but I know who he is.
Andy is now a professor at University of Colorado Boulder, running a wonderful music program and a really great recitalist. And they were all very young when we had them. And so I've known Nadine since she was really just beginning. But the point I wanted to get to was, I've sat on juries, and it's a challenge because obviously you want to do the right thing, and you know that it's important to the lives of these singers or instrumentalists. I've only judged singing competitions, and I often find myself a little bit at odds with some of the other jurors. And the reason for that is, you said what is right. I understand that how they were on the day. I remember once I was on a jury, and there was a young man, a tenor, who was good looking and he had a nice voice and he sang well enough, and everyone said, "Oh, we want him." I spotted a soprano who was a little rough around the edges, but to me, she had infinitely more potential. And on the day, she was not the best, and the others didn't notice her even because this was her first competition and her dress didn't fit right and she was very awkward, but she just had it. And I really wanted to acknowledge her, to give her at least a second or something, but none of the other judges would have it because they didn't see what I saw. And I'm not naming names here at all. The tenor didn't go anywhere and the soprano did. And I'm not saying I was right, but I just mean that in judging, do you think it's more important that we pick the best person on the day, or we try to spot potential?
It's so hard, Fred. And I think I would find myself sometimes at odds with juries in competitions, because sometimes I would see someone and I would see a Rolls Royce voice, and maybe it wasn't so perfect what they did, but my goodness, just the raw talent is amazing. But then the jury would often go for the person maybe that doesn't present with that kind of raw talent, but they do everything. I mean, in skating terms, they nailed the triple salto. And you have to sometimes do honor to the fact that, you know, I might have a Rolls Royce voice, but if my runs are sloppy, my runs are sloppy in that day. And you have to honor the person who was meticulously prepared. And it's, you know, what I find with being in a conservatoire is sometimes, you know, people grow at different speeds. And sometimes, you know, the raw talent may be the raw talent and reaches their plateau in the conservatoire, whereas the person that has meticulously prepared actually has growth. So it's very hard to predict the future. But I do understand juries that say, you know what, you have to nail, you didn't have to pick that piece. So I hear your talent, but you didn't manage to put it all together. So I have to go with this person that put it more together. But personally, I can sometimes see, oh, I just want to acknowledge this person's great talent.
I've sat on some juries where we are required, and I'm pleased to do it after the fact, to talk individually to every artist and to give my candid but caring evaluation and say that this is something you did very well. You might want to look at your vowels or whatever it is. And it's not that I speak gospel, I don't, but they can take my words as being sincere, and if they get something from it and work on it and benefit from it, that's fine. There are other competitions where the jurors do their work, they sit remotely, and then they walk away. Where do you stand on the role of jurors
Oh,
that way?
Fred, I think feedback is hugely important. I think it can be terribly destructive. So I think you have to be very careful and if possible, brief your jury. But at the end of the day, sometimes a jury person, especially if they're not a teacher, may say the wrong thing. But I mean, even your vowels thing, I remember one of our students got feedback from a jury member who said, I love your consonants, but your career is in your vowels.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, I think feedback, especially from someone who's objective, who just doesn't know you and doesn't have anything, just to say this is what I'm feeling. But it's definitely possible to cause damage by a thoughtless remark. And the other thing I suppose I would say is nobody has a crystal ball, so you can never say to anybody you're never going to have a career because of. And I think that's where it can kind of spill over into something potentially destructive.
That can be hugely damaging, and I've told the story before, so I'll just give the bottom line. One of my major professors at undergraduate in the States took me inside one day and said to me, and he's British, you have no future in the performing arts, which is like a stab to the heart.
Well, I mean, God almighty. I mean,
And
yeah.
I was 18. And
It's so foolish. I mean, and one of
yeah.
our professors, David Adams, I remember him saying to me in an interview that when he went to Freiburg, he had a professor, and David is an amazing musician. And the professor at the organ, the professor said, well, that's not very good. And David said, well, how could I get better? And he said, I don't think you can get better, and it's like, come on, do your job,
Wow.
please. So yeah, that's, that remark to you is foolish. Or Virgil Thompson, I think, said about Sibelius, he's the worst composer in the world. Well, have you heard every composer in the world?
Yeah. The equivalent is when people say to me that that's the best fettuccine in Rome. Have you tasted all the fettuccine in Rome? I practically have, but even at that, I would never venture to say what the best is.
Yeah.
One more thing about competitions, and then I want to go back to education.
Mm.
There is, in some context, in some juries, in some cases, issues of looks and issues of race, and occasionally issues of gender, but less so, because if you're casting in different categories, you need a soprano. But as I said to you, this jury that I sat on, where I liked the soprano who didn't place, the tenor was good looking. And if you have a good looking tenor and he's tall enough, those are the ways sometimes people think about the potential of the performer. And as I said, he was fine, but there was nothing to me remarkable about him at all. But I do know that certain voice categories, and there's looksism, and there is, unfortunately but true, racism. And do you find that this has entered the jury setting in juries you've sat on?
No, but that is because I don't sit on international juries, professional juries. So the kind of juries I'm on are college level. And we're perhaps education is more evolved. At the end of the day, we're not marketing productions that are relying on seats. We have different areas, but we are working as a sector very hard on equity and equal opportunities. I mean, Fred, if you saw, we're leading a study on gender, and there are slightly more women than men in conservatoires, and there have been for ages. But then if you go to the professional orchestras, for instance, in the leader positions, well, firstly, there are about a third to 2/3 women to men in orchestras. But at the leader positions, first violin or principal in the things, I mean, the men are like 80-20, 90-10. in favor of men. So something happens, even still in the gender between college, where you've equal opportunities, and whatever the perception is. So for me on the juries, this visual thing isn't there. And it's I don't want to run an opera company. I don't want to run that kind of thing, because I know they would have dilemmas. But it used to be a safer place. I mean, no one would have said Joan Sutherland was the most beguiling looking Gilda, but oh my God, what an interpretation, what an incredible voice. And that's exciting. I want to see the voice. I don't care if they look like a movie star. That's what I'm going for. But people are balancing. It's very visual. It's, they're competing against cinema, they're competing against TV, but I don't find it personally important for me. I want to hear what they're saying, and I want to believe the character and the visuals. I want more diversity, not less, on what I see on stage.
When I hear people talk about that this heavy singer or this 45-year-old singer can't be convincing as a young girl in love, well, people of all ages and sizes fall in love.
Mm-hmm.
And in the United States, the statistic is that 61% of us are overweight. Mm. So therefore, all those heavy people are in love too. A lot of them are. And a lot of skinny people are not in love. So the looksism is not about the human emotion that connects to what opera is about, and recital and song. You teach, I know, is that correct?
I do a small amount of lecturing, really small at this point. Yeah.
Your training is in piano.
Yeah.
Do you teach piano, or do you teach musical issues and ethics, or musicology and theory? What do you teach?
At this point, I teach a survey course in history for first years. I did piano, and I played piano, and I would have performed with singers as a vocal coach, but really my training would have been in music theory and musicology at master's level. And then I did an MBA, and my work went to that. But I do find it important every year to teach at least one survey class for incoming students. And it's really a question of getting to know them, because our numbers are small. I do want to know people's names. I want to know who they are. I want to find out at the early stages what makes them tick and what their ambitions are. And that's my kind of sneaky way of finding out.
That explains something to me, because the first time I got there and I spoke, as you asked me to speak to a bunch of students, you knew every name. And I'd never encountered the head of a school who knew the name of every student.
Well, it's part of our unique selling proposition, really, to use a business term, that because we have a very large junior school, and we have a very small and elite tertiary wing. We have only 150. It's 175 this year, actually, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate students. That's not a lot of names. But what we want is, we want them to have a very intense and very busy and active student life. But we also, in the academy, would feel ourselves to be a family, that there's a kind of an intensity. Oh,
so Deborah, I'm interrupting. The internet connection went unstable. I think you said we want them to have a very intense, I'm guessing is what you said, but we lost you after that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we want them to have an intense and very family-based experience. And if you have to know people's names if you want them to be part of a family. Because the numbers are small, we can do that, Fred.
Mm-hmm. Am I correct, and I'm thinking from memory now, that there's a musical instrument on the Irish flag?
Not on the Irish flag, but in our coins, the Irish harp. Yeah.
Harp. Talk about the Irish harp. Do you teach it at the school?
We do. And we actually had a famous Irish harp maker in our basement. And we have two very notable harp teachers, one Irish, one concert harp. So we would be very much associated with the history and the development of the Irish harp. In its heyday, it was played with metal strings, and you had to grow your fingernails, and you kind of scraped through the harp with your fingernails, which wasn't the funnest thing to play, I would say. But now it's gut strings or plastic strings, and it's much, much prettier.
You gave us a lovely list of musicians and works of music that you want our listeners to go to. One that I enjoyed listening to very much that I didn't know was the Prokofiev Sonata for flute and piano with James Galway and Marta Argerich, a beautiful combination. But I wanted to talk to you about the Chopin Ballade number 1.
Mm.
I had a guest on in October named Anique Lafarge, who wrote a book called Chasing Chopin that I recommend to you,
Mm.
about her passion for particular work by Chopin and how she discovered his life and history and emotions by making that work her study. And you chose for the pianist Alfred Cortot, who was a French Swiss man who lived 1877 to 1962. And he had a life that was colorful. I don't mean sexually, but I mean in terms of the Nazis on one side, then the other side, and the Vichy government, and helping Jews or not helping Jews, and those whole stories from the middle of that century. But what I didn't know about him is in 1919, he founded the École Normale de la Musique, one of the most important music schools in Paris. And I had no idea that Cortot founded a music academy. Did you know that when you picked him, or?
No, I did not know it when I picked him. I picked him. I knew that he associated with amazing musicians like Casals, and it's not uncommon for great musicians also to want to teach or to be part of teachers. I mean, Bach would be a great example. But I picked Cortot because I find his interpretations really interesting, really exciting. I think he's not perfect. I mean, he really struggled with memory towards the end of his career. His recordings that are live, they have a lot of splashy notes. But I don't need perfection in my music. I need personality and uniqueness, and he certainly had that.
Mm-hmm. In January, one of my guests was John Rubinstein, actor, son of Arthur Rubinstein.
Wow.
And we spoke about, and I can send you that, and listeners can find it by going to YouTube, entering Fred Plotkin, John Rubinstein. He spoke about the fact that his father, at a certain point, had memory issues and missed notes and so on. But what came out of the music making, despite that, or in addition to that, or because of that, that was so meaningful. And I believe that music, especially for people with memory issues, we know that music embeds in a different part of the brain. It's not that Rubinstein had that issue, but he missed notes. But there are people for whom that profound cognitive loss, but somehow the music connects, and the music remains, in part because it's in a different part of the brain. So I've spent time, I love going to the Verdi home that he built for retired musicians in Milan. And there are many very fine retired musicians, but they've built a wing now for people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And I like to go there and talk to those people because they're ignored. And I remember on a visit, there was a woman who had been in the chorus of the Verona Opera and could barely communicate in Italian, didn't have any language, but she said, "Would you like me to sing something for you?" I said, "Of course." And she sang for an 82-year-old a really good Visi d'arte from Puccini's Tosca.
Wow.
And after that, I said, "Thank you." And she said, "For what?" And I said, "Well, you just sang Visi d'arte for me." "No, I didn't." She didn't remember, but
Amazing.
knew all the words and all the music. And that
Yeah.
to me was a valuable lesson.
Yeah.
As we close, and I thank you, this has been a wonderful and instructive visit. I know that I always learn with you, and I know that people listening have learned a lot. And you've given us a lot to think about. I miss Ireland, and what I am conjuring in my brain are the sounds that I know in Dublin, because acoustically, it's a very particular city, I think because it's near the sea.
Mm.
And one of the places I stay is in a neighborhood, so not in the middle of the city. And I have a room that I get there that has a little roof terrace, nothing fancy at all, but I just sit out there and I see the gray sky and I see the rain, and I drink my tea and I eat biscuits or porridge, and I just sit and relax. And one of the sounds always are the gulls, the seagulls that one can hear in the middle of Dublin, which I can't think of any other city. Maybe Hamburg has that, where you can hear gulls that way. Maybe Bergen in Norway as well. but it's a very particular sound. But also, I hear the sea, I smell the sea in Dublin, but also because of the particular movement or lack of movement to the air, you can hear conversation, you can hear laughter, you can hear singing in Dublin. And it's part of what I love there is not just the interaction when I'm with people, but when I'm alone, how alive the city is acoustically. Is that something that you experience, or are you used to it because you live there?
I think you have described it in a way that I've never thought of. I think it's amazing. You know, you can be living in a city your whole life, but then I listen to you and you actually make it sound fantastic. I'm going to go out after this and I'm going to listen to my city in a new way. So thank you for exposing me to
Mm.
that poetry. But yeah, I mean, I live by the sea. I am of Dublin. I know what you're talking about. In every day, you're going to hear some kind of conversation and something is going to be unusual about it. You're going to hear the above the traffic, the gulls, the sound of the sea and the noise. And I suppose it is a kind of a soundscape. It's almost John Cage-like, isn't it? The idea that you
Mhm.
put a frame around a country and that its sounds are musical in themselves and that no country's sounds are going to be similar to the other country. So I promise you, Fred, sitting here in Dublin, I will appreciate the ambient sound of my city much more that now that you've given me that lovely pen picture.
Well, part of the beauty of life and travel when we get to travel, and it's the thing I love most with music and other things, but travel is, I think, number one. Um, is the people who talk on the things you learn that very redheaded woman all those years ago said to me, the Irish are much more subtle than you think, because she was the one who made me think of your country in different ways. And I have met many very fine people there, especially women in Ireland, I will say that, who just have so much to give and so much to share. Veronica is definitely one of them, and you are definitely one of them. And I'm very grateful for your friendship and also for what you do for music. It shows, and that's why I wanted people elsewhere who listen to my program get to know you and get to know the Royal Irish Academy of Music. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Fred. And I cannot wait for a time to come back and see you in New York when travel is possible and, we can just reconnect. But in the meantime, aren't we lucky that we have music and our love of music and great cities and countries to live
We
in?
are, but there's a problem, Deborah. When you come to visit me here, I won't be here. I'll be in Ireland.
We can do a house swap.
Sorry. Thank you, and my best to all of you there, and keep up the